Why not? Cool. Is everyone ready? All right. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I kind of know how hard it is to pull yourself out of bed this early in the morning, so I do appreciate you doing so. Today we're going to talk a little bit about web application sessions. Just 2 seconds on my background. I work for a company that is a multi-tenant SaaS company, and I do a lot of web application assessment and some consulting for them. And today we're just going to go over some of the more interesting things that happen in modern session management. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with the old, boring ways of doing session management that most apps have done it for 20-something years. But today we're going to take a look at a little bit different format, see what some of the newer languages and frameworks are doing, and just some of the things we can do to help protect our users a little bit better. So, my question for you guys is, how many of you, by show of hands, are web app people? You would say that you do web app stuff by trade. Cool. Awesome. Thank you. How many of you guys would consider yourself programmers, coders, full-time? Awesome. Cool. And then pen testers, finally? Awesome. So we've got a really good mix. I'm really excited about this. I intentionally made this presentation as a kind of half and half, and I was really afraid it would just be all one side or the other, and that wouldn't work out well for anyone. So excellent. All right. So let's do a quick recap on session management, kind of a 20-second overview. And we're going to try to do this in actually 20 seconds because we've got plenty to cover today. All right, so web app session management looks a little bit like this. This is Bad Twitter Clone. Ben Holland, if you're in the audience, thank you for making this. This app is great at doing things horribly. We're going to go ahead and just log in as our admin here. Boom, I've logged in. Now if I take a look up in my cookies, I'm going to see that I have a Bad Twitter Clone session ID right there. And that cookie identifies me as me to the server. It knows that someone with that cookie value is admin. If I clear that cookie value and refresh, sure enough, I will be logged out. All right. If that was new information to anyone, welcome to Web App. All right, so you're in for a wild ride for the rest of the day. Okay, so one thing I wanted to start this entire presentation out with is the idea that sessions are better than credentials from an attacker's perspective. I cannot stress this enough. Passwords are so boring compared to sessions. Because if you've got two-factor auth or multi-factor auth, but you've stolen the session ID, boom, you're in. If you have IP address restrictions, typically those are only checked at login when the session is created. You usually don't do it per request. So again, defeated. Finally, browser validation. Like, hey, you've never come from this browser before. Guess what? Defeated. Sessions are the keys to the kingdom. They're the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. If you have the session ID, you can wreck someone. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about situations where that can occur. So everyone remembers Heartbleed. That was a good old time. I want to focus on the very bottom here where Mandiant actually had a very large, I believe they said later it was a defense contractor, that had their SSL VPN concentrator actually broken into by an adversary because on like the 2-day period before they could get it patched, someone ran Heartbleed, and the proof of concept script, the first thing it would do is just dump out from memory like the last GET requests that had come through, and of course those contain cookies, right? And so they would take the cookies out of those GET requests, pop them in their browser, and hit that SSL VPN concentrator, and bam, sure enough, you're in. This was actually in my opinion, one of the bigger problems with Heartbleed. There were a lot of people really focused on key loss, and frankly, I didn't give a damn about keys because you can just rotate those and the problem is solved, especially if you use like perfect forward secrecy. But the session theft stuff was really serious. GitHub, after Heartbleed, actually reset all sessions because GitHub sessions are, of course, very long-lived. Same for things like Facebook and stuff. So definitely a big concern. When it comes to sessions, there's only really 2 things you need to remember. So how do we do that in practice? We never log it and we never lose it. So when we say logging it and losing it, logging it is really easy. Your developer types, those of you who are like pen testers or work for a company, your developer types often don't understand the value of a session ID to an attacker. And this is very common. I think most developers who aren't really security oriented that I've ever talked to have never really never really thought about it in this paradigm. So it's something to really mention. So they like to put it out in the logs, those types of things, write it to telemetry data or whatever. Make sure that never happens. We should absolutely never log session IDs. In addition, never lose it. So let's talk about losing it real quick. Let me just move my mouse over here. I need to move something out of my view. There we go. So how safe is your session cache? For instance, do you use Redis to do session caching? At some larger apps and enterprises, you won't hit the database every single time because it's not very performant. One of the things we see more commonly these days is using something like Redis to store these session values so that we're not looking up in a database every time. It's a very slow operation. Thing is, Redis doesn't have any crypto on its connection by default. You have to wrap it with something like S-tunnel. And in addition, Redis by default has no authentication. You can put a password on it, but it's pretty easily brute forceable. The protocol is very fast. So yeah, like it's one of these deals where you might be shipping your session IDs of your users out to who knows where, and those could be up for the taking. You have to really understand your infrastructure and how it's created and developed and supported to know whether or not that's happening. So let's talk a little bit about session cookie insecurity. Well, all cookies, not just session cookies, all cookies have flags. HTTP only, which is a flag that says only send this cookie on HTTP connections and requests, no JavaScript use, things like that. And then we also have the secure flag, which says only allow the cookie to be sent over HTTPS secure connections, right? So if you're going to be setting a session cookie, you're going to want both of these flags. You don't want JavaScript reading it, and you certainly don't want to send it over non-secure connections. I'm going to have this slide at the end, but I'm just going to give everyone a free preview. If you have a web app that you give any care about whatsoever, you must SSL encrypt every single page. Not just the login page, not just some pages, every single page. Because if you don't, you might be leaking that session ID over an insecure channel, right? And then it's worthless. Does anyone here work for Facebook or Instagram? Okay. Well, Facebook used to do this, and Instagram still does. So go fix your stuff, Instagram. All right. So yeah, if you are on public Wi-Fi and you want to take over someone's Instagram, by all means. Okay, so we're going to do a quick demonstration here of why this is a concern. Let me just copy some code and bring up our browser. All right, so we're going to go back to our good old crappy bad Twitter clone site here, and I'm going to log in as a user called XSS. I think you probably know what's about to happen. So bad Twitter clone suffers from a horrible problem where it doesn't sanitize anything at all. But, you know, it's really not any different than web apps I've seen that are college like projects or something. So what we're going to see here is a very simple script tag. We're going to post to one of my favorite services. Let me bring this to the top. I operate crappypastebin.com. It's a really crappy implementation of Pastebin. No copyright infringement. So Crappy Pastebin accepts arbitrary data at arbitrary URLs, and that's all it does. And so it's a great way to like store little 1 meg blobs. I use it for demonstration of cross-site scripting on a regular basis at my place of employment. So what we're going to do is put in this little thing that says, okay, we're going to paste, use Crappy Pastebin to send some data to /Derbycon, and the value is going to be document.cookie, right? So we're going to go ahead and post that message. Woohoo, message posted. We're going to log out and log in as my favorite user, admin. You'll have to forgive my inability to see the screen well. I don't have it cloned over here because I'm using Presenter View. All right, we're going to read the tweets of that user. Go over here. Yay! Okay, so let's take a note of our session cookie. This is a very, very basic, very simple cross-site scripting example of session ID theft. So we can see here that our session cookie ends in 4M, RE, looks like 5. And sure enough, if we go over to crappypastebin.com and go to Derbycon, yay, the demo worked. So what we've done, of course, is exfiltrate this session ID to some other place, and we could put that anywhere we wanted, and we could read it. One of my favorite things to do to demonstrate this, we actually have a lab at my place of employment that I kind of set up, and they have to log in and fire this is the login for a missile turret. And so they have a little USB missile turret with a webcam, and they can remote into it and fire at me and everything like that. But in real life, as you can imagine, it would be very devastating to read out these session cookies and then replay them. So I want to stress again, the HTTP only flag would prevent this attack because our JavaScript would not be able to read the cookie's contents. So very important that you keep those flags in mind. They have a lot of benefits. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about user-generated content. So GitHub.com puts all this user-generated content, well, at least pages that serve HTML is how I really should phrase this, at github.io. Google.com uses GoogleUserContent.com. Facebook uses its Facebook CDN. And Heroku.com, which is a infrastructure as a service provider, uses HerokuApp.com. Why? Does anyone know? Scope. Yes, scope. So one of the things that Heroku actually ended up finding out the hard way is they used to put all of their users, so for free you just get a subdomain on Heroku. So if I create a new project called Hello World, it used to be called helloworld.heroku.com. That's a really bad idea, and Heroku had to force all of their users over to a new domain when they realized how bad of an idea that was. Because cookies have scopes. Subdomains have the ability to set cookies for their top-level domain. That's really important, because if you have something like app.yourcompany.com, and that's all locked down, you have change control, you might encrypt all that data, you might do a lot of due diligence to make sure that application's safe. Meanwhile, if you're just sitting over here in dev.app.mycompany.com, allows anyone to modify it, change it, push new code to it, it's going to be a wild party of the worst type for you. So what we want to really stress is that if you can set those cookies, bad things can happen. Make sure that you do entirely separate domains. Only prod systems should ever have access to your top-level domains. Period. End of story. If you see it being any other way, raise the alarm. You've got a serious problem. All right. So I kind of like to do questions in line as opposed to at the end because it's a little bit easier to throw them out as you think about them versus waiting until the end and try to remember them. Does anyone have any questions so far over what we've covered? All right. We'll keep running. So let's talk a little bit about session fixation. Session fixation is another one of these vulnerabilities that is pretty, A, it's kind of hard to describe, and B, it's pretty bad. So let's talk a little bit more. We'll use our plain old demo again. We're going to use our bad Twitter clone. The best thing about PHP is that it allows arbitrary session values. By the way, when I said best part, I mean the worst part about PHP. We can actually set arbitrary values in our cookies and send them to the server, and the server will keep like, yep, that's a good cookie value, I don't care. That's really, really scary. With an application that is not necessarily secure, that can be a serious concern. Let's take a look here. I'm just going to demonstrate that by just changing the last part of this cookie to have the value CC at the end of it. And I need to navigate off of my site, which will change that cookie. So now I've sent that request to the server, and the server did not do a set cookie back to me that had a different value. So it accepted that, and now that value is in the session store and ready for potential shenanigans. All right, so this allows for much easier session fixation. Session fixation is the concept of getting a user, let me see. Session fixation is the concept of getting a user to start using a session ID that you set. Now, this could be kind of interesting, right? Let's say you get a session all ready to go, but it's not logged in, but you know the session ID, and then you phish someone and have them maybe fall for that phish. They go to the site, and if you can somehow set their session ID for them and they log in, then that session ID becomes valid while you're in control of it. Kind of cool, right? So we're going to go ahead and see that. And again, the best part about this demo is it's stock PHP. This is the standard out-of-the-box PHP behavior, which is horrifying. All right, so what we're going to do, I've actually already set this demo up just because it's a little bit more prickly. But what we're going to do is kind of a two-pronged approach. First thing we're going to do is to set a document.cookie value. But the interesting thing is people often like to tout, well, I'm safe because I use no script, or I have JavaScript turned off, or I use content security policy on my site and we don't allow inline JavaScript. That's fine. A little known directive of HTML actually allows you to set cookies via meta tags, and you cannot turn this off. You cannot disable this behavior. unless you like compile your own Firefox or something, and if you want to do that, have fun. But we're actually going to just take a quick look at what this might look like. So the funny thing is, so I've marked this up in Photoshop, but I accidentally sent this email to my friend Matt in the front. Raise your hand here. Yay. So I accidentally sent that email to him when I meant to send it to myself, and he was really confused. But one of the things that we might have is a phishing email go out that looks maybe a little bit more convincing than this, and someone clicks that link, right? So let's take a look at what that could look like. Once again, we're going to read some tweets. Actually, I need to log back in. Let me do that real quick. All right, I'm logged in as admin again. By the way, this is what happens if you're admin. It allows you to see this super awesome screen. All right, so I am admin. I'm awesome in all things, and while I am being phished, see here, where are we at? Go to the top. So Eve has provided us some tweets. And sure enough, of course, we don't have proper output escaping, the number one sin of all web apps. And in the meantime, my session cookie has now been changed to this value, bluefish. By the way, any of you who are just getting into pen testing, I cannot stress enough how important it is that you find a string that you probably won't find in a production web app and use that as your one token to always find things. So I have my burp configuration pretty much just set up that if it ever sees bluefish in all caps on anything, it just starts going, hey, you did something over there. So I would strongly encourage that if you're kind of new to the pen testing realm, kind of choose a string and stick with it. So as we can see now, I'm bluefish. Now, if I go back to the home page here, we're going to notice that I've been logged out, which we would expect, right? Because my session cookie is now changed, and it's this bluefish value. But as you can imagine, if I log in here, I'm admin. Sure enough, I'm logged in as admin, and unfortunately for us, my session ID is still bluefish, meaning that anyone who now knows the URL for this site can log in as the admin. Very bad. So, first thing we need to talk about then in this case is how to fix that problem. And thankfully, it's pretty easy. So when we want to fix session fixation, all we have to do is make sure that we hand out a new session ID every time the user authenticates. Now, one thing that is a cardinal sin in web applications, and we see this a lot, is that someone will send you a new cookie, they'll give you a new set cookie directive, and not invalidate the old cookie you were using server side. Go into your database, kill those cookies. You have to do that. There was a very, very large, very well-known in the Valley sign-on provider. So you've got these big single sign-on solutions that maybe you use to sample into some of your apps or something like that. There's this really big Valley company, very well-known, that is a sample provider for a number of enterprises, including my old, we used to use them. And then one of the issues that we had was that we found that you could just delete the session cookie, or you could log out, and it would just send a set cookie that deleted your session cookie, and if you still had that value, you could just plop it back in and you were back. It would never actually kill those sessions. They would last for days. And if you would log out, again, it would just delete your cookie. It wouldn't actually kill it server side. And the problem is that when we reached out to the vendor and said, hey, this is a huge concern, they really didn't seem to act on it or care that much. Now, the funny thing, I'll give you a quick story. I love doing security stuff because I know how it works at our company. And watching it, just fall apart at other companies is one of my favorite hobbies. So I submit this email to their support, right, saying, hey, your session IDs are all screwed up. Now, they actually moved that into their ticketing system, and every time someone internally commented on it, I got an email notification with their comment, which was awesome, because it sat dormant, and then 6 months later, just some random developer guy was like, hey, this is a big problem, we need to fix this, and then someone else was like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, they're overreacting, this guy doesn't know. I can see all of it. So, just... Also, check your ticketing systems to see if you're leaking data across those. But that's more of a user error thing. So yeah, if you're going to talk bad about your customers, do it behind their backs, not in front of their email account. Of course, we want to say, give your HTTP only flag on your cookies. Impress all your pen tester friends. This is, again, basic kind of 101 session stuff, but you'd be surprised how often we see these things not happen. If you work for a company that kind of moves at a higher velocity, where developers have a lot of freedom to do what they want, you'll see this time and time again in new applications. They're missing the secure flag and the HTTP only flag. And that's okay. Just reach out to your developers and let them know, here's what you need and here's why you need it. As long as you can make it an educational opportunity, that's something that you're going to not have to fight for very long. I know at our company we've seen this happen less and less, so that's been really nice. All right, finally, you need to do your best to ensure that your app can't be tampered with. Now, obviously, we all know the normal, cross-site scripting, prevention mechanisms, all that fun stuff. I'm here today to say, do content security policy, and do it by also enabling or disabling the unsafe inline directive. For those of you who don't know content security policy very well or understand what this unsafe inline directive is, the short version is this. If you have content security policy and you disable unsafe inline, you cannot have JavaScript in your HTML template files. That pretty much renders cross-site scripting impossible. It's very, very, very difficult. And it's a large development effort. It's kind of a thing. People will moan and complain, but your auditors or pen testers that you use as third parties are going to be much happier for it, and your application will be substantially safer. So something to keep in mind. Yes?
So if you use cross-site scripting to be able to change the cookie, if you can't find a cross-site scripting vulnerability, are there other ways you could, if you found session fixation but not cross-site scripting, are there other ways to take advantage of it?
There's not going to be a lot other than the subdomain one that I talked about, because subdomain could be an option. Or you could do the cross-site scripting stuff. If you happen to be able to inject something like a meta tag, you might be able to do that. But yeah, there's not going to be a ton of options. At least I can think of off the top of my head. If anyone has an idea, feel free to throw them out. But I think that's pretty much the main ones. Oh yeah, change session IDs and URLs. If you're looking at an application and you see what looks like could be a unique identifier in a URL, panic. I remember back in the old days of PHP BB, the old bulletin board software, they would move the session ID in the URL. Why? Why would you do that? You're emailing these session IDs out to people like, hey, come look at my post I just made on this forum. Like, oh, that's weird. I followed that link and now I'm you. That's not necessarily a great idea. So yeah, if you see any unique identifiers like that in a URL, something is horrifically wrong. All right. So let's talk a little bit about new directions. So I did promise in this talk we're going to talk about some of the newer things that we do, new frameworks, those types of things. And one of the big trends I think we're seeing in the industry is, who needs a stinking DB? It used to be kind of all the rage that, you'd back your app with a relational database and everything was simple. And those days are kind of gone as we've gotten to the cloud and we're doing these much larger apps that are maybe more easily scaled. We're kind of seeing the disappearance of DBs when it comes to session management. Now, there is reasons for this. Number one is, sorry, I'll go back one. Number one reason for this is just performance. So database calls, of course, take time. If you're in some environments, they take a lot of time. It kind of depends on where your app's at and what it's doing and what infrastructure service you've chosen, but sometimes these calls have a very high latency to them. So what we want to do is we say, well, let's give the data to the client to hold on to. So this is a pretty popular paradigm in a number of frameworks. What we'll do is we'll just HMAC the data, and we'll send it as a cookie value, and the user will just hold on to it for us. And then every time it comes back, we're just going to take our HMAC, or we maybe have an RSA key pair. We're just going to verify that signature is valid, and we'll move on from there. Now, in and of itself, this is fine-ish. We're going to go into some caveats, but you can understand why people would be motivated to do this. If you can shave 100 milliseconds off of every web app call, you're going to have some motivation to do this potentially. So let's talk about maybe why that's kind of a scary ordeal. Did anyone tell the security people? You developer people in here, I'm sure you've heard this like 1,000 times this conference, because security people love spewing it at you. But if you're going to be doing something kind of new and cool, make sure you let your security team know, because there's probably implications of that. And this is a great example of that. Sure, you can get rid of your session management in your front end, or heading back to your database, and put it on the front end of things. But there are security ramifications. So here's a major security ramification of this very minor change. This is roughly what that HMAC process would look like for generating your cookie. Typically, we base 64 the data, have some sort of delimiter in there, and then just do an HMAC on that data. And out comes this, beautiful, weird-looking string, right? So if we base 64 decoded that data, usually it would be something like this. You would just see a JSON blob. And typically you just have something like, here's the user's ID, maybe here's what, like company they're with or whatever. Maybe you'd have their email address in there. And you just reference that information. And hopefully you validate it. If you ever encounter something like this, change the signature portion, make sure it fails. If it doesn't fail, you've got some serious problems. You should probably pull the plug on your web app. So let's imagine, though, that we could change this UID of our user from 1234 to 0, right? Well, this would happen. You would be king of the world, right? So in most web applications, you can probably log in as some sort of user with elevated access. Even if you can't, like I said, I work for a multi-tenant kind of SaaS app. So if you can change UIDs to someone else, that's a big deal in our environment. We don't like that. So this is something that is actually pretty easily done in this whole HMACing environment. Because if you remember HMAC, something you have to have is your secret, right? You pass in a secret into these hashing functions and out comes data. But if you don't choose a good secret, you've really screwed yourself up. Because you've got this one password to rule everything now. Because if you lose this password, someone can just start forging cookies, and that's not going to be a fun time. So we just have to hope, we have to hope like hell, that these passwords people are using isn't something like change me or secret. The entire security of the entire application rests on this one single string, and that string is probably checked into your source control. So, if you even suspect this could be happening in your applications, be awfully careful. One of the things I wanted to mention is, so I graduated from Iowa State University, and so did several of my classmates who are here today. And we have the cyber defense competitions, which are different from the NC CDCs that are available. Ours are a little bit more localized. But one of the things that we have is regularly we'll see applications that are these new style applications, and they'll hand them out to all teams, and all these teams will be running them, and they never change the secret. And so you can gain a foothold on one, and you've got this signed cookie, and you can just march onto any other app, replay that cookie, and as long as the secrets match, you're in. It's a devastating and awesome and hilarious attack. Because these teams will lock it down to the nines, they'll think everything's great on the box, they've got everything patched, they've found all the vulnerabilities, they didn't change the key, and they're just like, how? I'll never tell. Never ever. All right, so one of the things that's really interesting about this scheme is that it's actually going to allow us in some situations to do remote code execution. And you might be asking yourself, how the hell do we get from just changing cookie values to a remote code execution? Well, this is a really good example of, again, developers not necessarily, I'm not trying to rag on developers, but developers wouldn't necessarily understand some of the risks involved with making some architectural decisions that put a lot of power in the hands of the client. So we're going to look at an example of that in a couple frameworks. But first, let's define serialization. Serialization is the computer science term in the context of data storage, Wikipedia, by the way, that we say we take data in a given structure and object state, and then we put that in a format that can be stored. Right? So if you're familiar with, so Python is kind of my jam. If you're familiar with Python, you're familiar with the operation called pickle. If you're using C#, I think it's just called serialization. If you're using Go or Ruby, it's called marshal and unmarshal. All of these terms mean the same thing, is serialization. But if you're in Ruby and Python, being serialized means that you have to be extra super careful. And here's why. Because in most languages that are static and strong, statically typed and pretty basic, you're just going to unmarshal and marshal these objects and it'll just be their state. But think back to your knowledge of Python or Ruby, especially Python. In Python, one of my favorite and one of my least favorite things about that language is that you can run anything from anywhere. Really, throw a print statement anywhere you'd like, and as long as it's indented the right amount of spaces, Python will run it. Doesn't matter where. You can just be like class definition, I don't know, print something in it. Yeah, let's print something there, why not? Let's print something at the top of the file just to make sure it works. And so all of these things can happen anywhere, which means, and this is a hilarious thing, so Python serialization format, pickle, you can define an object, and it's just going to run whatever you put in that object definition automatically when you load the object. Because again, that's part of Python's nature is to bring these objects in and immediately start working on them. So if you create an object that just says, hey, go, it's just going to go, and it's going to run your statement. So, demo time. This is going to be fun. All right, so let me get a string that I'm going to need over here. So today I've prepared a simple string. I'm going to pull up every pen tester's favorite utility in the world, right? Burp Suite. I've prepared a string already, and how I generated it is going to be a long, complicated process that you guys don't care about, but Google it, that's all you need to know. So what we see here is a base64 encoded pickle value from Python. And over here we see some interesting things. We see a system call to say cat as the password, cat as the shadow. Now, I made this Python app that we're about to demonstrate, and I actually didn't even mean to do this, but just in this hack VM that I've got, you know, let's be honest, security people, a lot of the stuff you do in your sandboxes, you do as root, right? Like just, you know, in your sandbox, in your Kali VM, you know, you're just happening to be running as root. And so to demonstrate this, I wanted to, you know, get it to a privilege point where it could be able to actually read the shadow file, so I needed to be running my web app as root. But then I realized that I was just running it in a screen session already as root. So a good reminder, least privilege, be careful for that. All right, so of course, remote code execution is only as dangerous as the permissions that you have in the context of the system, so keep that in mind. All right, so we've got this little app here, and it's real basic. All it's going to do for us today is, sorry, one second. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on here. There we go. This is a real basic app. All it's going to say is hello world, but what we're going to notice is that we're using, so this is Django, which is a very popular Python templating engine and framework. What we see here is that we've got this new session ID cookie just showed up, and just for clarity, we're going to kill this old guy here. We have the session ID cookie, and it's got this value. Now, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what's going on in the back end. So imagine that this application I'm already logged into. All it's doing is making a new session object and storing some value in it. In this case, I'm doing UID. If you were to take a look at this cookie, you would just see my UID equals 1, 2, 3, 4. But what we're going to do is copy and paste in that pickled value that we've pre-generated now. Now, the important thing to note, once again, is that I know the secret that we're using. I know this HMAC secret because I pulled it out of source code. And again, it's actually pretty easy to find a lot of these things because they're checked into repo. But in the situation here, I already knew it. And so sure enough, I'm going to refresh our page. And the funny thing is, it just explodes. But the real interesting point here, the real treat to watch, is what happened in my session window, because there's our shadow file and all of its goodness. So of course, if you're an attacker trying to do something particularly evil, you are just going to pop a shell in this box and have at it, right? So that's a great example of why these serialization methods are highly, highly dangerous. So the real lesson here is never, ever, ever use a serialization format to store these cookie values. You don't need to store an object containing someone's session. Just use like JSON. Which is actually exactly what people started doing. So in Ruby, versions 4.1 and up, they changed from using these serialization methods to JSON. The same is true for Python, Django 1.5 or 6 and below. And after 1.6, they changed to JSON. Same for this Flask framework as well. But I don't want this to necessarily sound like we don't have this problem anymore. These changes for all of these came through in 2013. There's a lot of applications out there, we all know we've got them, that are old. You know, we haven't updated them in a long time, we haven't changed frameworks or something like that. Even if you've upgraded your framework, again, this is the default behavior, but you might have something in a settings file that's still using this mode. It is available in the code bases, you just have to explicitly say you want to use it. How certain are you that when someone upgraded your framework, sessions didn't just break and they went, oh, I need to go change this back to this, right? So something to keep in mind, if you're doing a pen test or anything like that, if you've got access to your source code, take a look, see what we're doing. If you're seeing any sort of serialization, unserialization going on, that's going to be a big problem. Another one that gets honorable mention is the Bottle framework for Python. Calling it a framework is even a little bit maybe too much. It is a very, very basic system for doing some templating. But still to this day, Bottle uses the Python pickle method. And the worst thing is that there's even open issues on their GitHub. And people are like, for the love of all things, please stop doing this. But they continue. So let's just take a quick look at what that looks like here. There we go. Loading, 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 rawhide. Oh. Please wait. System processing. All right. If anyone knows my password, you've got like 60 seconds. All right. So when you're doing your white boxes, anything like that, first thing, get into some of that session code and take a look and see what you've got. So in this, there we go. In our example right here, we see this pickle.dump_s and load_s, which is a example of that happening. All right, let's head back to here. Let's talk about active session theft, aka suck it two-factor. So how many of you noticed, you might not have been able to see it at your distance, how many of you noticed that I am located at getholb.com right now? A couple? All right. So I'm the proud new owner of a new domain that's about 3 days old called getholb.com. Now, one of the things that I love to do in phishing attacks is active session theft. It's so much fun. It is so trivially easy to set one of these up. So what I've done is created a very simple reverse proxy setup, right? And I'm sending all of my traffic to github.com, the real one, and I'm just doing a very simple substitute that just says anytime you see github.com come through in the page content, change it to getholb.com, right? So really, that's all it takes to set up a simple reverse proxy. And the best part about the internet today, we all know how horrifically broken like the certificate stuff is for SSL. It's like a $9 cert from Komodo, and they're just like, yeah, whatever, here. As long as you give us our money, we'll do whatever we want. I get my $9 cert. I've got everything that's going well. Oh, by the way, I'll put these slides. I'll actually just put a big link to these slides, the URL or something. I'll make a teeny URL at the end of this, and you guys can grab it and just stick around after. But I'll give you 2 seconds to get the photos here. So one of the things that is particularly fun about these is that in Apache, Apache has this awesome ability that you can actually log cookie contents. So I've got a custom log statement written in another file just for my access combined. All you have to do is just say, I want you to log this cookie value. And you can just get the session cookie that GitHub is using and put that in that log statement. So I've actually got this, this pulled up. Sorry here. This is the one window I forgot to have logged in already, ready for this presentation, so my apologies as I get logged into the system. All right. Oh, should already be there. So one of the things I love doing with our users when we do phishing attacks is these kind of like active ones, because we are a shop that requires two-factor. Boom. Go. Nice. So I wrote this really simple Python script. Oh, it's not. Uh-oh, demo fail. That's not good. Sorry, let me check that out. I'm going to speak while I do it. So I wrote this really simple Python script, and all it does is tails the Apache log file, looking for these session cookie values. And when it finds one, it launches a headless Chromium instance on the server and replays that session cookie into that headless instance and then takes a screenshot. You have never phished your users more effectively than when you can show them a screenshot of their profile logged in, because that is a truly horrifying prospect. Bonus points for doing it for your single sign-on provider, because then you have access to everything, right? And that can be really scary. I'm actually not sure why that worked. The script is running and everything, but no matter. I'll try it one more time. If it doesn't work, we'll just let it go. I can't see. Am I on the right domain? Yeah. All right, last-ditch effort. Did it work? Yes. There we go. Haha. So yeah, this is a screenshot of the settings page, and of course you could choose any page you wanted. One of the ones I use for, it's also a very effective one, is just load their Gmail inbox. Like, there's nothing really quite as effective as showing someone their own email account. We're going to talk about ways that we can detect that as well, because more importantly than just owning people, you also want to take a very critical look at your systems and try to figure out why was I able to do this, right? So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. I don't just want to say that this is all about owning things. So active session theft is a little bit like a Michael Bay movie. It's not very subtle, though it is very good at causing destruction. The problem with these is that it's all of a sudden all this traffic might be coming from some different IP address, right? Like you were just hanging out, and then boom, you're coming from a different IP address. And then on the front end, your user probably got phished to be able to get this, and if they notice that URL, you might get taken down real quick. That domain's probably going to vanish from underneath you real fast. So I do want to mention that session theft is great. Probably only really good for like targeted attacks type of things, though. But who knows? So let's talk about malware-based session theft. Actually, let's not. Let's hold up. Does anyone have any questions so far? This is one of those pause opportunities. All right. If you think of any, let me know. So let's talk about malware-based session theft. Grab cookies off the system and replay them. So it's much easier, much quieter way than doing the whole phishing attack. Just get your user to download some malware. So here's in C# a very, very simple example of what it used to take to just read cookies out of the cookie store for Chrome. It was as simple as just loading up the SQLite database, doing your select statement, and then you get the cookie value and you can exfiltrate that wherever you want. Now, to the Google team's credit, they thought this was way too simple. And so they added encryption on their cookie values. So I added 4 new lines of code. Because they use for Windows, for example, they just use the Windows key store. And Mac, they use the Mac key store as well. But you can just ask if you're already logged in as these users, you can then ask for the user's context to get the decryption key and then decrypt it. So it's really not that much better. So all that to say, of course, the old paradigm about make sure that you are, really, really safe on your endpoints is so important. Now, one of the things I want to mention too is that I think in our industry, we get to this point where my users don't have local admins, so come at me, bro. No, Chrome or any other browser on the internet, it stores its cookie store in the local session context on the person who's logged in. If you're logged in, you can get to it, right? So if I download malware that can pillage the cookies, I can probably hurt you in some ways even worse than if I had local admin on your box. Now, obviously, there's some caveats that may or may not be the case, but in a lot of environments, that is the case. So let's talk about what this looks like in the real world by pillaging cloud apps. And Salesforce is the first one up to date. And for the record, it's not necessarily their fault, though they're probably capable of doing a little bit more to protect themselves. So Salesforce had a variant of the Zeus Trojan created for a targeted attack against a Salesforce user. And I didn't say a Salesforce employee, I meant a user who pays for Salesforce. Now, the interesting thing about this one is that it simply waits for a Salesforce session to establish. And once there is one, it downloads and exfils the data in bulk as much as it can find. It just pulls the whole thing and then sends it. Now, this is from a little article right there that I've mentioned. And again, and there's going to be slides available. But the question I have for you guys is, and that was a real attack that caused real damage, how badly can I damage your company's image when it's not your company's fault? How much are you doing to protect your users to make sure that this does happen to them, the damage is localized and minimized? So I challenge you guys today, fight for your users. All right, so step 1 to fighting for your users. Use TLS everywhere, all the time, uncompromising. I'm at a security conference. If that's news to you, good luck. All right. Let's talk a little bit about geographic fencing. This is one that I believe in very strongly. Your user session moves from Milwaukee to Glasgow. Should you be alarmed? Yes, you should be alarmed. Now, what I would recommend is actually implementing, so getting geographic data is so easy now. The MaxMind DBs are free that do IP to city and stuff. You've got Nginx modules, Apache modules that provide that to you as a request header. All your application needs to do is check the latitude and longitudes. There's a very basic formula out there called haversign. So you can just plug in a lat long on 2 different points, and it will tell you the great circle distance between those 2 points. And after that, you can set up a boundary at your liking. You could say, hey, if a session moves 50 physical miles, kill it. And that's a really, really simple and easy way to prevent these types of attacks from happening. Because if you see someone move from one continent to the other, it's probably not a good thing. And even if it is a legitimate session, the user probably won't mind. That would be one of those things where I'd be like, yeah, I would expect to be logged out when I move from one place to the other. Second one, this is kind of it's nice to have, but easily defeated. User agent pinning. If your user is using XPIE 6 and all of a sudden shows up from curl, you've probably got a problem. And again, it's not like we can't spoof user agents, right? But this is just another thing you can do, because if it's happening in the background and an attacker's unaware of it, they might not understand what's going on, but they still could be causing enough alarming and noise that you can look into it and try to understand a little bit about what's happening on the back end. One thing that comes up kind of often is IP address pinning. A session moves from one ISP to another. Should you be alarmed? Now, the thing is, I would actually argue no. No, you should not be. A lot of enterprise customers, a lot of very large companies, they have several routes to the internet, several different ranges, several different ISPs. I've seen cases where someone is in San Francisco, and all of a sudden they start showing up in LA. So it's not necessarily that they've moved, it's purely that their ISP, they just started taking a different route out to the internet. Happens all the time. So I wouldn't recommend doing IP address pinning unless you're okay with logging out your users pretty forcefully and pretty regularly. That's kind of up for you to decide how crazy you want to be on it. One of the things I really want to stress, though, is that you need to beef up your alerting. If an IP previously had 0 sessions per day coming from it, and all of a sudden has 5, that's probably an alertable event, right? You should probably be alerting your SOC if you see anomalous behavior like that. Keep a rolling average. I would recommend Splunk for doing this. Splunk's a really great tool for this. You can just keep a moving average of like, okay, over the last 5 days, how many sessions have I seen from this IP? And when it spikes, investigate it. It's a really simple thing to do, and it should, like the attack I'm describing here where you do active session theft, that's going to catch that, right? So something to keep in mind. The other thing I want you to do is talk to your vendors. It's flooring to me how many very large web apps don't do anything at all. Flooring to me. Ask your vendors, do you do anything? Is this an attack that you've conceived and thought about and you have a defense for? And test them. Start a session in one place, and let's be honest, we're all nerds, right? Go get an AWS account in like China. I can't do that. I don't know where AWS region is, but I'm sure China's not one of them. Go get something in Ireland and pop that session into your browser and see what happens. And if it still works, you should probably be on your vendors, because that is not something that I would consider to be normal behavior. And with that is it. I hope you all learned something today. Now I'll open it up for any last questions. If anyone has any thoughts or comments, now's the time. Booing, tomatoes, all that stuff. Yes? That's a great point. So he mentions Wi-Fi to 3G. That would happen a lot. Could really soil your user's experience. I can't agree more. You have to look at your applications. I think for this talk is kind of focused at business applications, right? That wouldn't necessarily be mobile. But if you have mobile APIs into those applications that a mobile app uses, you might need to make special considerations for those. And you can do that on a case-by-case basis, of course. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes? Yeah, so if you've got a situation where someone's got a Java applet that has to have access to that session cookie, here's the thing: is I would still write that up, right? Like, they can defend it all they want. It is still a business risk, and so that's one of those deals where, I'm not sure what you can do other than to say, maybe you have some logic in there that just tries to be extra careful about how it's being used, something like that. But yeah. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I would never suggest that all cookies need to be those 2 flags. There's definitely cases where you can't. There's JavaScript logic at our company that absolutely needs to be able to set and write cookies as part of the user experience. So, no, I completely understand and agree wholeheartedly. All right. Anything else? We've got 1 minute. All right. Sounds good. I appreciate everyone coming. Thank you so very much. I'll stick around outside if you guys have any last minute questions. Thanks.